He was a name whispered in hushed tones, a specter haunting the darkest corners of America. Israel Keyes was not just a serial killer, he was the embodiment of calculated evil, a predator who moved through life cloaked in normalcy. Unlike many of his depraved brethren, Keyes reveled in the absence of a signature. He was a chameleon, shifting his methods with each kill, leaving investigators grasping at shadows. Keyes meticulously crafted his persona, constructing a facade of normalcy so convincing that it would take years for the truth to unravel. He was a construction worker, a family man, a face lost in the crowd, but behind the mask of ordinariness lurked a predator of unparalleled cunning, a master manipulator who turned the mundane into the macabre. His crimes spanned a continent, leaving a trail of shattered lives and unanswered questions. He toyed with authorities, relishing the fear he instilled with each carefully planned attack. Keyes was a nightmare made flesh, a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters often wear the most ordinary faces. And the most terrifying aspect of all, we may never know the true extent of his crimes. The seeds of darkness often find fertile ground in the shadows of a troubled childhood. In the case of Israel Keyes, these seeds were planted early and nurtured by an environment that was both isolating and oppressive. His story is a chilling reminder of how a toxic upbringing can shape a person's destiny in the most horrifying ways. For Israel Keyes, those shadows stretched long and deep, shrouding his formative years in a veil of isolation and despair. The rural home where he grew up was not just physically isolated but emotionally barren, a place where the seeds of his dark future were sown. Born into a deeply religious family on the fringes of society, Keyes grew up estranged from the normalcy most children take for granted. His family adhered to extremist beliefs that further alienated them from the outside world, creating an insular environment where young Israel had little exposure to anything beyond their rigid doctrines. His family, steeped in extremist beliefs, lived a life of seclusion, rejecting the modern world and its temptations. This isolation was not just physical but also ideological, as they shunned any influence that did not align with their narrow worldview. This created a breeding ground for the dark thoughts that would later consume Keyes. Young Israel, starved for connection and starved for something he couldn't name, found solace in the company of violence. The lack of emotional support and the oppressive atmosphere at home left him searching for an outlet, and unfortunately he found it in the most disturbing of ways. Animals became his first victims, their silent suffering a testament to the darkness festering within. This early cruelty was a clear warning sign, a red flag that something was deeply wrong. Yet, in the isolation of his upbringing, these signs went unnoticed, or worse, were ignored. As Keyes grew older, his fascination with death morphed into something more sinister. The violent tendencies that began with animals soon escalated, as his mind became a dark playground for increasingly twisted fantasies. These were not just idle thoughts but detailed plans that he would later act upon. He began to fantasize about inflicting pain on humans, his mind conjuring up scenarios of control and domination. These fantasies were fueled by the isolation and the extremist beliefs that had been ingrained in him from a young age. They provided a twisted sense of purpose and power that he craved. These dark fantasies, fueled by isolation and a warped sense of reality, festered within him, slowly twisting him into the monster he would become. The lack of any positive influence or intervention allowed these thoughts to grow unchecked, turning his mind into a breeding ground for evil. The warning signs were there, whispers of the depravity to come. These whispers were not just in his actions but also in his demeanor, the way he interacted with the world around him. Yet, in the echo chamber of his isolated upbringing, these signs were drowned out by the overwhelming silence. But in the isolation of his upbringing, those whispers went unheard, lost in the echo chamber of extremism and neglect. The environment that should have nurtured him instead became a crucible for his darkest impulses, shaping him into the person he would become. The monster was growing stronger, and soon, the shadows would no longer contain him. The isolation and neglect that had defined his early years had done their work, and the world would soon come to know the true extent of the darkness that had been festering within him all along. The United States Army, a crucible where ordinary men and women are forged into weapons of war. It is a place where discipline, strategy, and the art of combat are drilled into recruits, transforming them into soldiers capable of facing the harshest realities of battle. For many, it is a path to honor and service, a way to protect and defend their nation. But for some, the skills learned in the military can be twisted into something far more sinister. For Israel Keyes, it was an opportunity to hone his already present darkness, to refine his capacity for violence into a lethal art form. The structure and rigor of military life provided him with the perfect environment to cultivate his malevolent tendencies. The Army's training programs, designed to create disciplined and efficient soldiers, inadvertently became the breeding ground for his dark ambitions. He enlisted in 1998, his young mind already a breeding ground for sinister desires. The induction ceremony marked the beginning of a transformation, one that would see him evolve from a troubled youth into a calculated predator. The camaraderie and brotherhood of the military masked the internal storm brewing within him, a storm that would eventually unleash itself upon the world. Military life, with its emphasis on discipline, strategy, and the cold, hard realities of combat, provided the perfect training ground for a budding serial killer. The rigorous training exercises, the relentless drills, and the constant focus on precision and efficiency all played a part in shaping Keyes into a formidable force. He absorbed every lesson, every tactic, every strategy, molding them to fit his own dark purposes. Keyes excelled in his training, his superiors noting his discipline and proficiency in weaponry. He was a quick learner, mastering the use of various firearms and other weapons with ease. His performance reviews were glowing, filled with commendations for his skill and dedication. But beneath the surface, his true intentions remained hidden, masked by the veneer of a model soldier. He was a model soldier, his outward demeanor masking the darkness that churned within. His fellow soldiers saw him as disciplined and reliable, a man who could be counted on in the heat of battle. But they were unaware of the sinister thoughts that occupied his mind, the plans he was formulating, the skills he was honing for a purpose far removed from the ideals of honor and duty. But beneath the surface, Keyes was learning more than just how to kill efficiently. He was learning how to disappear. The military's emphasis on stealth and evasion tactics became a crucial part of his education. He practiced blending into his surroundings, moving silently and unseen, mastering the art of becoming a ghost. These skills would later prove invaluable as he embarked on his reign of terror. He studied evasion tactics, camouflage, and the art of blending in, skills that would later serve him all too well in his reign of terror. The ability to move undetected, to strike without warning and then vanish without a trace became second nature to him. The military had provided him with the tools he needed to become a ghost, a phantom moving unseen and undetected through the world. The military had unwittingly provided him with the tools he needed to become a ghost, a phantom moving unseen and undetected through the world. His training in stealth and evasion was thorough, and he took to it with a disturbing enthusiasm. Every lesson, every drill, every exercise was another step towards perfecting his ability to disappear, to become invisible in plain sight. By the time Keyes left the Army in 2001, he was no longer the troubled young man who had enlisted. The years of training and discipline had transformed him into something far more dangerous. He had become a weapon, honed to a razor's edge, his mind a repository of deadly skills and knowledge. The military had given him the tools, and now he was ready to use them. He was a weapon, honed to a razor's edge, his mind a repository of deadly skills and knowledge. The discipline and training he had received in the Army had shaped him into a formidable force, one that was now unleashed upon the world. The monster was now fully formed, a predator with the skills of a soldier and the cunning of a killer. The monster was now fully formed, unleashed upon the world with a soldier's discipline and a predator's cunning. The skills he had acquired in the military, the discipline, the strategy, the ability to move unseen, all combined to make him a deadly force. The world was now his hunting ground, and he was ready to unleash his reign of terror. Israel Keyes was a chilling anomaly in the annals of criminal psychology, a meticulously organized killer who thrived on chaos. His name sends shivers down the spines of those who study the dark recesses of the human mind. Unlike many serial killers who follow a discernible pattern, Keyes was a master of unpredictability. He was a ghost, a phantom who moved through the shadows, leaving behind a trail of terror and confusion. His methods were as enigmatic as they were horrifying, making him one of the most perplexing figures in the history of crime. He meticulously planned his crimes, but his methods were a study in calculated randomness, designed to confound even the most seasoned investigators. Keyes would spend months, sometimes even years, preparing for a single act of violence. He would bury kill kits containing weapons, money and other tools in various locations across the country, ensuring he was always ready to strike. This level of preparation was unprecedented, and it allowed him to operate with a terrifying level of efficiency. Keyes meticulously avoided establishing a pattern. He understood that predictability was the enemy of the serial killer. By varying his methods, locations and victims, he made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to connect his crimes. This deliberate randomness was his greatest weapon, and he wielded it with deadly precision. He would travel vast distances, crossing state lines with ease, to select his victims. Keyes was a nomad, constantly on the move, never staying in one place long enough to raise suspicion. He would drive for hours, sometimes days, to find the perfect target. This constant movement made it incredibly difficult for authorities to track him, and it added to the sense of fear and uncertainty that surrounded his crimes. His targets were chosen seemingly at random, their only commonality being their vulnerability. Keyes had no specific type. He would prey on anyone who crossed his path at the wrong time. This lack of a clear victim profile made it even harder for investigators to predict his next move. He was an equal opportunity predator, and his victims ranged from young to old, male to female, making everyone a potential target. He would stalk them for weeks, learning their routines, exploiting their weaknesses, before finally making his move. Keyes was patient, methodical, and relentless. He would watch his victims from afar, studying their habits, their schedules, and their vulnerabilities. This meticulous surveillance allowed him to strike with devastating effectiveness, catching his victims completely off guard. His crimes were as varied as his victims. From abductions to home invasions, from strangulation to shooting, Keyes employed a wide range of methods to carry out his horrific acts. This variety further complicated the efforts of law enforcement, as there were no consistent patterns to follow. Each crime was a unique event, a standalone tragedy that left investigators grasping at straws. He was a master of disguise, able to blend into any environment and assume any persona. Keyes could be anyone, anywhere. He would change his appearance, his mannerisms, and even his voice to avoid detection. This chameleon-like ability made him incredibly difficult to identify and apprehend. He could disappear into a crowd, vanish into the night, and re-emerge as someone entirely different. He would abduct his victims from their homes, from parking lots, from the street, leaving no trace of his presence. Keyes was a ghost, slipping in and out of his victims' lives without leaving a single clue behind. His abductions were swift, silent, and utterly terrifying. He would strike when his victims least expected it, taking them from the safety of their everyday environments and plunging them into a nightmare. He would torture them, kill them, and dispose of their bodies hundreds of miles apart, erasing his steps with chilling efficiency. Keyes took great care to ensure that his crimes would never be traced back to him. He would transport his victims' bodies to remote locations, burying them in unmarked graves or disposing of them in ways that made recovery nearly impossible. This meticulous attention to detail allowed him to evade capture for years. Keyes was a master of deception, a puppeteer pulling the strings of chaos. He reveled in the confusion and fear he created, manipulating the world around him to suit his dark desires. His ability to control the narrative, to stay one step ahead of those who sought to stop him, was a testament to his cunning and intelligence. He understood that predictability bred capture, and he refused to allow himself to be boxed in by routine. Keyes was always evolving, always adapting. He knew that the moment he became predictable, he would be vulnerable. This constant state of flux kept him ahead of the authorities and allowed him to continue his reign of terror. His crimes were a macabre symphony of randomness, each note carefully chosen to create a chilling masterpiece of terror. Israel Keyes was not just a killer, he was an artist of death, crafting each act of violence with a precision and care that was as horrifying as it was impressive. His legacy is one of fear, confusion, and a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the human soul.